This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 457. We number them every week because they do go out as tape cassettes by subscription. September the 7th, 1980, and this would be the first half hour, side one of the tape. Lists of back tapes are available if you send me a self-addressed stamped envelope and 50 cents covering the titles for the past years going to March 1977. And the list, the bibliography of each week's tape is available if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope and 10 cents to cover the printing. You can get a list of sources of information that I put out each week. I did discuss part 1 and 2 of Ronald Reagan, and I will continue with the candidates and do a part of Ronald Reagan this evening. But before I do that, there were a few articles in the news that I thought were important, and I'll take a break for a few minutes. Once in a while, I announce a local program or something of interest here. Amnesty International is having a meeting at Monterey Peninsula College. This is Tuesday, 7:30 this week, and I'm going to attend that meeting. I think it's time that we got involved into organizations. I'm not an organization person. I did go to demonstrations during the anti-war movement, belonged to the Peace and Freedom Party and various groups that were protesting, whether it was mind control or lobotomies or the war operations, the Cambodia invasion, and so forth. But there is so much going on in various countries at the present time that is getting us towards a Nazi police state that I think Amnesty International is an organization worth attending and supporting, and seeing how far they go into these other countries in addition to the Soviet Union. They did do reports on Colonia Dignitat in Chile, and they have pointed out problems in many other countries around the world. Just this week in the news, just past week, there was an article, UPI, report of Bolivia army outrage. The orgies of killings, kidnappings, rapings, military regime are taking corpses and beheading them and carrying them through the cities. They're loading them into trucks. They're taking miners, workers, and putting gunpowder in their mouth and blowing them to bits, and people are disappearing. This was August the 22nd, 1980, a UPI report. Another one, August 24th, 1980, Brazilian rightists begin terror drive. This was the New York Times. Anti-communist firebombing, snipers, vandalism, threats to Jewish nursery schools to blow up, Nazis in power in Brazil. The military regime has been in power 16 years, and they're getting more desperate. There are beatings, attacks, and so far, no arrests. Another article this week, New York Times, Korean dissidents belong to the endangered species list. A new president in South Korea, the court-martial of 23 supporters of Kim Dae-jung, military control of the government, 400 journalists were dismissed. 168 people have been arrested since May, 97 students, 24 politicians, journalists, and pastors. That is just a small amount of the group that were massively swept up and kept from demonstrating. Another article this last week from the Los Angeles Times, doubts, fears, and bombs beset the Jews of Argentina. They're beginning the bombing of synagogues and schools, threats of violence to the Jews, anti-Jewish bookstores. They're printing again everywhere the Prodigals of the Elders of Zion. This was a forged document brought to Mr. Henry Ford, and he had it printed and sent all over the world that the Jews want to take over the world, and the bookstores are being threatened if they carry literature by Jews. And there's a quotation in the New York Times, if you aren't white or a Catholic, you are a suspect. Another article this last week, Bolivia becomes a battleground. Fearful of democracy, Argentina is supplying the money and the arms for repression. Another article about Argentina and missing people. Thousands of people have vanished. A New York Times article, August the 26th, many countries in the West do not understand the gravity of the issue in Argentina. Since March of 76, 5,000 have been murdered and 7,000 to 10,000 are missing, and many of them in the past year. Another article on slave labor in Libya, the importation of people to work for oil companies that are reduced to deprivation and torture, building roads, factories, and so forth. Another New York Times article just this week. I'm citing this week's articles, not my accumulation of the year. Just August 25th, New York Times, Brazil, women protest crimes against wives. The men are just rampantly shooting them, as they are in India, in front of the children and getting rid of them and picking up new women to do the housekeeping and service their needs. Another article, August the 28th, Los Angeles Times, life in a Jamaican ghetto, so much killing and so little worth dying for. Nightly raids, 350 people killed since January, shot, stabbed, killed with machetes, murder by the People's National Party, the gangs ganging up against them with the possibility of CIA destabilization and interference in Jamaica. And an article, Nunn wrote a poem. She came back from El Salvador. This was in the San Jose Mercury, August the 28th, this last week. Her poem was, "Cursed are the poor, for theirs are the jails and the tombs of the nations. Cursed are the hungry who search for a better life. They are massacred for being organized. Cursed are those who feed the hungry or give drink to the thirsty. They shall be accused of subversion." So for this reason, I believe that it's time that, in addition to working during the day and doing the research and the radio programs, that I go to the meeting. It's a group in Seaside here have wanted to open a chapter. There is a chapter in Sacramento and San Francisco of Amnesty International. And I think it's time that we get out and be counted for these atrocities. And just about everyone that I cited has been instigated by the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Army. And similar to the way that Hitler spread his Nazism all over Europe and in France and other countries in addition to Germany, the United States is an octopus that has set arms to these police departments, torture instruments to them, approves of the repression. We had our ambassador there for the inauguration of the president in South Korea, the new president, who went in on a single vote and has his opponent tried and on trial for subversion. And the United States is recognizing this government, and Japan and the United States supply all the means for the repression. And if we don't like it, it's too late to apologize later. It's time to get out and do something. I do a lot, but no matter what we do, I think we can do more. Yesterday, in the San Francisco Chronicle, on the front page was a large box that said Oswald's widow's plea, and then the article was Oswald's widow urges the opening of his coffin. Those of you that are familiar with my radio work in the last 9 years know how many times I've talked about the Oswald doubles and the book that I'm writing about Lee Harvey Oswald and the Oswald doubles. But this was a break in the fact that Marina Oswald had a press conference in which she stated, in quotes, "I am no longer sure Oswald is buried there." She wants to end the mystery of who, if anyone, is in the grave. And she said there was a commotion at the funeral, and it was suggested to her that the body had been stolen. Those of you familiar with my work know that Marina Oswald was consulted, according to the Warren Commission, about cremating a body in that grave. But now she's come forward and said that she's not sure the body is there. Robert Oswald admitted in this newspaper article this week that the person who was supposed to be his brother, Lee Harvey Oswald, had a different hair texture, a different hairline, a different accent, and that he might have had electroshock in the Soviet Union. He doesn't want the body dug up. It's causing him a distressful situation. He said he can't conduct a normal life, and he's deeply depressed. Robert Oswald is holding up the exhumation of the body. There are several points that I want to make briefly on exhuming the body of Lee Harvey Oswald. On November the 24th, 1963, the FBI turned the body of Oswald over to the Secret Service. But on November the 23rd, the day after John Kennedy was killed, they wrote a report, the FBI, measuring Lee Harvey Oswald, his length and, according to inches and weight, was different than the Secret Service report. He was 5'9", weighed 140 pounds, and he had no scars on his body. They turned the body over to the Secret Service, as I said, on November 24th, when Lee Harvey Oswald, or a person with the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, was killed. And November 25th, the FBI had wanted to fingerprint more the body. They weren't sure at the time of the burial, just before the burial. They were taking cameras and fingerprint machines in to the cemetery, to the mortuary, to double-check the fingerprints and so forth, and they had contradictions between the fingerprints on the body and those of the person known as Lee Harvey Oswald in the Marine Corps. December the 3rd, after the burial of this particular body, the FBI went to the hospital in Fort Worth to check the medical records on the mastoid operation that Lee Harvey Oswald had in February 1946 when he was much younger, because the FBI report had no scars on the body. And January the 21st, that was just a month later, Earl Warren ordered the cremation of this body, even though there were discrepancies between the FBI reports and Secret Service reports in height, weight, fingerprints, Marine records, and so forth. Chief Justice Earl Warren ordered the body cremated, and after the order of cremation, January 21st, 1964, February 25th, a month later, the authorities of the FBI were still interviewing the doctor, Rosa Parkland Hospital, about scars and post-mortem examination of a person known as Lee Harvey Oswald. So there were discrepancies from the moment Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, whether there was another double in the jail. The orders to cremate him went ahead by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then they were still interviewing doctors later after the body was buried. Robert Oswald testified before the Warren Commission that he had trouble communicating with his brother in jail. He said that I wasn't talking to the Lee I knew, and they asked him to explain that again. And he said to me his answers were mechanical. I was not talking to the Lee I knew. Mr. Jenner asked him, did you get through to him? And he said, no, sir, he couldn't. And what was the expression on his face? And he replied again, I was not talking to the Lee I knew. District Attorney Wade in Dallas, Texas, in 1975, had an interview, October 3rd, 1975, in which he said he believed that Oswald had assistance, that there were one or more persons encouraging him, he said, to shoot the president, but I don't believe Oswald shot anybody that day. But Henry Wade said there may have been an arrangement for someone to meet Oswald and get him out of Dallas. In the book Coup d'etat in America, A.J. Weberman has a quotation of Marguerite Oswald. She told Mike Canfield, the co-author, my interest is in the framing of my son and who framed him. You know Jack Ruby pulled the trigger, but Jack Ruby didn't have my son killed. He just pulled the trigger, and that's the phase I'm interested in, which is the natural phase. I don't care who killed President Kennedy. What I care is that my son didn't kill President Kennedy. And so the case remains open. We don't know whether they will, in fact, open up that 2,700-pound steel-reinforced concrete vault. The body of Lee Harvey Oswald, or the Oswald double, is in that kind of a vault that was especially made before John Kennedy was killed, described by an engineer in California, Mr. Thompson, and they're going through elaborate procedures to open up this heavy vault that has tons of concrete over it in addition. In the weeks to come, we'll find out whether there is anybody in that grave, whether it is Lee Harvey Oswald, whether the grave is vacant, or whether Robert Oswald has his say, and they're not allowed to exhume it at this time. That's only temporary, because even if he has his say now, the issue will keep surfacing until finally it has to be opened up. I'm positive of that. There was an article I read today that really affected me very deeply, and that's the reason I decided to put over or do the Reagan discussion analysis maybe for the second half hour of this program, because there's so few intelligent articles today on the world situation. And there was one by Henry Still Commager. He's a writer, and he had an article in the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle titled An Irresistible Drift Toward Nuclear War, with a question mark. The thing that interested me is that I have studied the Pentagon, the military establishment, for 17 years now, and I'm convinced, as many of you know who've listened to me for a long time, that we're not drifting toward nuclear war, that this decision was made a long time ago by Mr. Dornberger, Werner von Braun, Reinhard Gehlen, Henry Kissinger, Mr. Brzezinski, the National Security Council. The decision for a war against Russia was made before the end of World War II, as early as 1943, when Hitler's chief of intelligence was working with Reinhard Gehlen and came to the United States and turned the OSS into the CIA. This article is an appeal, very late, but an appeal to reason. And he brings up the point that the political conventions this year are missing the most important problems that are going on in the United States today. He says the most conspicuous feature of the rhetoric and the planks is their refusal to address themselves to the reality of present world situations. And this author, Mr. Commager, refers to three issues. The issue of atomic warfare. It is an issue for which we ourselves are chiefly responsible. It is we who built the atomic bomb, and we so far are the only nation to use it in anger. We delivered the original first strike, and now we seem to be sure that it would be a deterrence to strike again. The second issue is that of natural resources and the right of people and posterity to inherit the earth. And the third issue is the question of nationalism and the recognition of major problems around the globe. And this article says the threat is not from the Soviet Union, from the Arab countries, from communist conspiracies, from internal subversion. It's not from wicked people like Hitler or Stalin, mad for power or destruction. It comes from us, and it goes on to say we are threatened by policies that both Americans and Soviets have, which gravitate almost irresistibly toward nuclear war. We are threatened by a paranoia that sees the Soviet Union as a mortal enemy, bent on destroying the United States. There never has been, and there is not now, any basis for this fantasy. The Soviet Union has everything to lose and nothing to gain by such a global war. The United States has nothing to gain and everything to lose by such a war. A mutual suicide pact is not a policy. The Soviet Union violated international law by invading Afghanistan. But equally, this author goes on to say, we did the same. We had a 10-year invasion of and war against Vietnam and Cambodia, a war that enlisted 5 million of our fighting men, exacted casualties of 1 million people, and devastated an offending country with 7 million tons of bombs, more than we dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. The United States dropped on Asia alone. We are threatened by the delusion that nuclear war can be contained. This is part of the Herman Kahn principle of 49 steps toward an all-out war, and the military leaders are prepared to wage war as they would play a chess game. The reason I'm reading this tonight to share it with you is that it's an important story as a part 3 to Ronald Reagan and his cabinet of 100 advisors who are hell-bent on a world war. I'm not saying that Jimmy Carter isn't with Brzezinski in the National Security Council, but he kept us out of war this year with every excuse to go to war in the Middle East. But the Reagan team is hell-bent on war, and their advisors are very much in favor of war, much more so than Jimmy Carter if there's a degree of warfare, and I think both of them are pretty rotten, and I'm not campaigning for either one. The article says we are threatened by the illusion, still flourishing after 35 years of disproof, that one nation, presumably the United States, can gain and hold nuclear superiority over all competitors. This is an illusion that should have been dispelled when the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb 4 months after Hiroshima. We are threatened by the spread of nuclear power, which we should have known could not have prevented or contained any more than could the escape or evils from Pandora's box. 5 powers have the atomic weapon. 9 others are capable of making it. We call for nuclear parity, but our participation in this Cold War has stimulated an arms race everywhere else on the globe. We are threatened by a Dr. Strangelove aberration which can seriously contemplate a nuclear conflict with the loss of 100 million American lives, and that would be designated as acceptable. This sentence really got to me this week because I heard a quotation of one of the top officials of Washington, D.C., to the effect, I don't remember whether it was George Bush, and I don't want to quote the wrong person, to the effect that if even 8 or 9 million people survived a nuclear war, America would be ahead. They're talking about 100 million lives would be acceptable out of 225 million. The article says we are threatened by power and influence of the military, industrial, financial, labor, academic, scientific complex. When Eisenhower went out of office, he said, be careful of the military-industrial. But this is an honest appraisal because the academic world, the scientific world, the financial Wall Street people, the labor unions, and the labor markets are behind this. And he said they operate to encourage the government and society with the concept of security. 40% of all research scientists today are experimenting with weapons and atomic warfare at a cost on scientific progress that is incalculable. We're not using them for peace or peaceful means. We take our scientists to employ them for warfare industry. We are threatened by a demand for secrecy in government that goes along with weapons and the growing power of these organizations that operate in secret, engage in conspiratorial activities that endanger the operation of democracy at home and the maintenance of peace in the nations, between nations. That reminds me, and I'll interrupt that article for 1 second. In May of 1968, Ronald Reagan was at a meeting, the meeting of the Garden Plot, the secret organization of the National Guard, the U.S. Army, the military at a secret conference. And he made the remark at the meeting that was transcribed. You know, he said, there are people in the state who, if they could see this gathering right now and my presence here, would decide that their worst fears and convictions were realized. I was planning a military takeover. Reagan, according to this article by Ron Ridenour, has been a serious contender for presidency. This was written in May 1968, and he was not joking. The secret conference he was addressing was a meeting of strategists engaged in mapping out a nationwide campaign of official violence aimed at nothing less than silencing the voices of domestic dissent, quieting the campuses, blunting the civil rights movement, destroying the counterculture. The code name for the domestic military plan was Garden Plot. That was one of the experiences, California experiences, we had under Ronald Reagan. But I want to finish this article because it did affect me when I read it today. It said, we are threatened with a belief that God, nature, and history said that the United States would be number one in military and political power. And it goes on to say, we treat our competitors as enemies, our allies are simply instruments of our policies, and neutrals, such as China, we refer to as cards. Our China card, as if we play them with our American hands. Over a century ago, John Stuart Mill admonished us. He said, when society requires to be rebuilt, there is no use attempting to rebuild it on old plans. No great improvement in the lot of any area is possible until a change takes place in the fundamental constitution of our modes of thought. President Carter and Defense Secretary Harold Brown are already clamoring for more and more atomic weapons. Ronald Reagan knows for sure about this issue. He's telling us the Vietnam War, which after slavery was the most ignoble chapter in American history, was a noble crusade. Now, the conclusion of this article states, what is required is a statesmanship that can emancipate itself from the misguided assumptions of our past and guide us to new modes of thought. We need new thinkers, and they quoted a John Marshall who said of a statesman, what the times need today is one who must in some measure be master of the past and the present and the future. He has to see what is behind us as well as before us. You have to learn to separate accidental and human experience and reflect. You must legislate for the future, but you must put aside these old ideas of how the future is to be won. And in essence, the article pleads for people to study the past and not make the mistakes that other countries went through as they went down to defeat and annihilation. Unfortunately, in studying the history of Nazi Germany, we can't say Germany and Japan suffered for what they did to the 80 million people that died or were tortured, and the genocide and the experimentation, and the families broken up, and the cities bombed. They didn't suffer because the same people that armed Germany and Japan for those wars and for the international Holocaust were arming them again for World War III. They didn't suffer. They were rewarded by being put back into office and new contracts. So we didn't learn yet from World War II enough. Nobody got more than a slap on the hand, and a few men at Nuremberg were punished. And the rest were heavily financed to go out in the world and begin again what they didn't complete the first or second time. There is a book I bought this last week. I was at several book sales in Carmel and bookstore in Los Angeles, called The Official German Report. It's been written by O. John Rogue, R-O-G-G-E. And the thesis of this book is that communism and fascism both were born in the time period of 1917 to 1920. And there are many similarities between them. But while the media and people talk about the communist conspiracy or the fear of dividing the individual wealth and breaking it down according to your needs, the Nazism, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the pan-Germanism has never been a subject that people have feared. And this book goes on into the infiltration of South America, Central America, United States, Europe, Asia, of Germans starting in the 1920s in Detroit, New York, New Jersey, Cincinnati, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco. The headquarters for German fascism, very well planted in the Italian community with Mussolini, and funds coming from the Vatican for organized crime that went into Nazi and neo-Nazi organizations. Many good people, religious people separate from the network. There was a strong network of Adolf Hitler and the Vatican, the Italian, German, Japanese combine. And this Odessa, the Spider organization, was well implanted and has been a threat and has brought us to the brink of this nuclear destruction that was mentioned in the article I just quoted. These are the sources of the problem, I believe. And as you read the past books, and you have to go into many, many books on past history, this book, The Official German Report, was written in 1961. And I'm collecting books from 1918, 1920, 1930, or 40, or 50, in order to know how we are on the brink of accepting the death of over one-half the American population as that being acceptable by the people in Washington, D.C. You have to understand the mentality and the means and the techniques by which these people obtain their power, and it takes a lot of books and a lot of reading to collect information that we didn't just drift to the acceptance of a nuclear policy. And it's going to take more than a lot of wishful thinking to get out there and express your feelings about it to the people running for office. I believe it's a little late with Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan in office today, but we were in bad shape when Richard Nixon took office, and by the good grace of some Scotch tape at the Watergate Hotel, we learned more about the secret government, the infiltration of opening our mail and listening to the telephone conversations and blackmailing people and bribing them and setting women to blackmail them and so forth, the COINTEL program and so forth, the mind control program of the government came out as a spin-off of somebody wanting to entrap Richard Nixon. And Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter have so many skeletons in their past that maybe the yin and yang of this thing is that when they go too far, somebody will pull out the stopgaps and begin to expose them and some of their illegal activities and hopefully slow them down, put them on the defensive so that in terms of wasting neutron bombs and atomic bombs all over the world, they'll be more busy defending themselves and their reputation, because there is so much dirt to ask them about at press conference. There's so many scandals about these particular people that it's outrageous that they just simply throw out facts and figures of the economy or labor, or not that that's not important, but there are issues that they're not pinned down about, that they should be on the defensive. And we'll continue, as I have in the past years, of talking about these scandals. I'm going to take a break now. It is half hour, and this is Mae Brussell and Carmel, and we'll turn that tape cassette over and then begin part 2 of this program.
Thank you, Mae.
Get back with maybe some pleasant news and on to Ronald Reagan, but I do have some other things I want to mention. This article about the irresistible drift towards nuclear war and the history of America making a lot of blunders and taking this policy of aggression, constant aggression, until we do have this multiplication of weapons, didn't just happen. And one of the books that I was reading today, just in terms of relaxation, one of the subscribers to my tapes had given to me was a book called In This Wild Water, The Suppressed Poems of Robinson Jeffers. Robinson Jeffers lived in Carmel, passed away here in Carmel, and built his home here down by the beach. And he was quite a popular poet. He had written for 20 years, and Random House had published his books. But in 1948, at the end of World War II, he wrote a book called The Double Axe and Other Poems. And Bennett Cerf and his editor at Random House, Sax Cummings, began to censor Robinson Jeffers because they explained that his view of mankind as being inhuman wouldn't go well in America. He thought about World War I and II, and he described American leaders as being self-seeking and no better than Hitler and Stalin. He didn't write poems that we supported Hitler or Mussolini and put them into power, but he said that Americans had delusions about themselves as being kind people or nice people. And this is true. We have the idea that we're magnanimous or generous, and we don't examine our slavery or racism or the way we've treated the Indians in America. And so Robinson Jeffers presented a book of poetry, and they put a disclaimer on the jacket for the first time and turned what was a poet's right to express himself into a political issue by saying, we don't agree with what you're saying. And this book has 10 of the suppressed poems, which they absolutely wouldn't allow in the poetry book. So that we think of freedom of the press in this country as being different than Russia, that we can say things here that you can't say in the Soviet Union. But even a poet like Robinson Jeffers couldn't write certain poems. He wrote about mischief and war, and these poems are about young people following the orders of older people, of being seduced by the pimps of death. One of his poems, there's a line, the president and his paid mouths, and the radio shouters, the writers, the world planners, the heavy bishops, the England lovers, the little poets and college professors, the seducers of boys, and the pimps of death. And he tells how these doddering old fools, he writes a poem about these doddering old fools who maintain an intellectual posture and who prostitute themselves and shout for war. I think of Ronald Reagan getting on in years, he'll be 70 at the time of his inauguration, and never fought in a war. And this is what Robinson Jeffers was writing about. He was talking about a trap and sneaking mischief, how it sneaks up on you, and how youth imitate old people and youth go out to fight the war, he said in his poem For Old Gentlemen. And he referred to the mischief of the old men who seduce young people to fight for them. And in this book, it tells how Robinson Jeffers was regarding man as deceiving himself, that he is not superior and he is like a hawk. He's like Adolf Hitler. The American is like Hitler. And he said, we turn away from what we are. And these are some quotations of Jeffers. He said, we're completely trapped in nets of envy, intrigue, corruption, compulsion, and eventual murder, and international politics. We have always been expansive, predatory, and missionary, and we love to lie to ourselves. We have entered the period of civil struggles and emerging Caesarism that binds republics with brittle iron. Just like Caesar did, we identify and do what he did and are proud of it. He said civilization everywhere is in its age of decline. He wrote this in 1948. and abnormal violence. Men are going to be frightened and herded increasingly into lumps and masses. A frightened man cannot think, and mass mind does not want truth. However, truth will not die, and he has an optimistic opinion. If you would go out and look for truth, it is there. And he said, your life will be meaningless without it. You have to have a clear shift of meaning and emphasis on man's better aspects and sides, and don't delude yourself. And he went on that to delude yourself is to be sure that you'll be herded to your death. Now, the poems that were deleted in 1948 by Bennett Cerf and Random House that were included in this lovely book, it's called In This Wild Water, what he was saying then is absolutely true now. This is 1980. He was writing that in 1948, and the American people were not allowed to have the mind of a man who felt what was going to come as a result of our inability to face our own responsibilities. We were deprived of this artist, of his ability to say these things, even though they were true, and the opinion of Random House and Bennett Cerf was the American people can't handle those things. Well, I don't think we can handle what's going to come down if we continue to put our trust into these idiotic politicians and their warfare cabinets, the National Security Council, the National Security Agency, Mr. Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, and the like. Ronald Reagan was with Kissinger this week. Kissinger hasn't cleaned up the pain of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Chile, the death of Allende, all of the repressions and violence that he instigated when he was head of the National Security Council would be enough to put the man in jail. He shouldn't even be allowed to have a press conference. I consider his likes as war criminals, as murderers, as mass murderers, and yet they're the advisors to people like Ronald Reagan, and Brzezinski is the advisor or controls the foreign policy, or tries to, of Jimmy Carter. I'm going to digress now away from this dismal view of history and what we are facing in the future for a few other news articles of interest that time allows, just to get on Jimmy Carter's case for a few minutes before we do get back to Ronald Reagan. Maxine Cheshire had a wonderful article in the Washington Post. I've mentioned her before, and if your local paper has her weekly column called VIP, she's quite an amazing woman who lets out little bits of pieces of what's going on in Washington, D.C. She had an article this week about a man named Nathan Landau, who may be your United States representative to the United Nations in the next week or so. Landau was suggested to be ambassador to the Netherlands, but it turned up that he had links to organized crime, and they decided he wasn't good enough to play patsy, I guess, with Prince Bernhard, who also was under the table taking $1 million or more from Lockheed and running around with various mistresses in Europe. Prince Bernhard is married to Queen Juliana. She's resigned now, stepped down. She was the Queen of the Netherlands. Landau was supposed to be the ambassador to the Netherlands. As I say, he was linked to organized crime at the time of his possible appointment by Jimmy Carter, but now he's considered to be U.S. representative to the United Nations this fall for the 35th session. He has three possible links to organized crime. One is a man named Joe Neslin. He's a gambling kingpin in Washington who's a consultant and wanted to open up a casino in Atlantic City. Landau was planning an $85 million promenade casino, and he owns a high-rise in Bethesda, Maryland, where this Joe Neslin lives. They broke into Neslin's place and found his links to Landau, and that's what squashed the appointment at the time of Landau to the Netherlands. He also has links to Edward Cellini, the brother of Dino Cellini, the associate partner of Meyer Lansky, and Landau was supposed to open a hotel casino with Cellino down in St. Martin. Another link was with Anthony Plate, Plate, a member of the Gambino family of organized crime, who represented the family in Miami. Plate was indicted last year on racketeering and murder and loan sharking, and then he was found dead, presumed to be dead. His body hasn't been found. And Landau was vice president and director of a corporation called Quaker Masonry, which was run by Plate of the Gambino family. So right now, as I say, he's supposed to be the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Landau was finance director for Jimmy Carter Mondale campaign in Maryland. He went to China with Robert Strauss on a trade mission, and all I can say about the United Nations is maybe we should bring back Shirley Temple. I don't think she was that bad representing the United States, but I guess we'll never know. An article now, we'll go back to Ronald Reagan for the remaining of this program and next week probably. An article in the San Jose Mercury this last month on the discovery of Ronald Reagan. I'm always interested in the phenomena of these people that suddenly get a position to represent these huge corporations and the military defense system for the United States. I don't believe they just come out of a vacuum of making movies in Hollywood, such as Bedtime for Bonzo or whatever Reagan made. I know he worked for General Electric, but the story, one of the big stories about the political career of Ronald Reagan has been that his attention in politics began in 1964 when he gave a speech for Barry Goldwater and surfaced as somebody, a political man with a potential on the horizon, possibly to run for governor or some other office in California. His brother takes claim to fame by saying that he suggested to Goldwater that Ronnie should go talk to him. But another man, an editor of the San Jose Mercury here in California, Harry Farrell, has another story, which I think is interesting to the collage of Ronald Reagan because he was present at this meeting. And he talked about a man who was behind Ronald Reagan by the name of V. John Kriebel, Krehbiel. And Harry Farrell says that Kriebel was the first person to propose publicly that Ronald Reagan run for office, and that was 5 years before anybody else had discussed this possibility, that it wasn't in 1964. In 1961, Harry Farrell was present at a meeting with Kriebel, who was a Pasadena insurance man. Now, Pasadena was the center of the nucleus, the Lincoln Club, and the committee to put Richard Nixon in power, that fabric in the 1946 time period to get him to run in the House of Representatives against Jerry Voorhees. Kriebel's from Pasadena, insurance man, later the ambassador to Finland under Richard Nixon. And in 1961, he had the post of Republican State Central Committee. And according to Harry Farrell, in 1961, in January, President John F. Kennedy had just been inaugurated. He was expanding his new horizon, his new frontier. Pat Brown, the father of our present governor, was the governor in Sacramento, and the Democrats were in 1960. Pat Brown was the governor of California, and John Kennedy had won the presidency against Richard Nixon. But the Pasadena, California clique of Aerospace, Bank of America, and so forth had been behind Richard Nixon's career, and when he lost the election in 1960, they didn't give up. According to Harry Farrell, Kriebel went to Sacramento and tried to think of who he should have run against Pat Brown as governor. And they came to the conclusion in 1961 that Ronald Reagan would be the person. They didn't run him in 1962, but they decided he would run against Brown in 1966. There were two other candidates they considered, several others. One was a state senator, Dick Dalwig from Redwood City, who later went to jail for fraud. And the other was Peter Pitchess, the sheriff of Los Angeles County, who was very instrumental with Ronald Reagan's garden plot and the COINTEL program that I will get into in length and detail next week. Sheriff Peter Pitchess was involved with the Sharon Tate, La Bianca murders, the Isla Vista riots in Santa Barbara, the Ruben Salazar murder, and counterintelligence in the Los Angeles, Santa Barbara area. So Peter Pitchess was very important in the garden plot and the cable slicer committees that Reagan worked with when he was governor. But Kriebel named Ronald Reagan. He was a movie star, and they asked him, why do you want Reagan? This was in 1961, and he said, well, he heard him speak for General Electric, that he was their roving ambassador. So then he mentioned, Mr. Farrell mentions Nancy Reagan entered the picture, and she said to V. John Kriebel, are you serious? Did you mean that about Ronnie running for governor? And he said yes. Reagan stayed out of the 62 race. He re-registered from Democrat to Republican. And according to Farrell, this is a quote, with Nancy pushing hard, he's been running ever since. So the intent to use Reagan in his political machine is very important, because I did mention last week and the week before the links of Ronald Reagan to the team, the assassination team that was responsible for murdering John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, which made the road clear for Nixon to become president without the competition of the Kennedy brothers, and then in turn for Ronald Reagan to run for the office of President of the United States. Now, there was a little side twist to this article which was interesting because of the desire to get rid of the Kennedys as a political group and the competition of Kennedy with Nixon, was that Kriebel went on to be the ambassador to Finland under Nixon's appointment. And I don't know whether Kriebel, K-R-E-H-B-I-E-L, is a Finnish name or not, but Lee Harvey Oswald went to Helsinki, and one of the big mysteries of the Warren Commission and the investigation was that he took a boat to Europe, to Le Havre, France, and then to England, and he went to Finland. And there's no route of commercial airline that would explain the time sequence that he got to Finland. I have a friend in Salt Lake City that told me about his family being in Army intelligence and meeting Lee Harvey Oswald at an airplane in Finland, but that's something that we can't check out in any way, and he's never given me any positive proof of that, so that stays in a rumor stage. But Lee Harvey Oswald had assistance in Finland in 1959 before he showed up at the embassy, the American embassy in the Soviet Union in Moscow. The time sequence was always off and never explained. And I think the ambassadorship of Kriebel to Finland, or the link of a man behind Reagan and behind Richard Nixon, is important to check out further. I don't know how it would be done, but were there any contacts in Finland between this man and Army intelligence and the Pasadena connections to Richard Nixon? Sirhan came from Pasadena and was brought to the United States in 1957 by the CIA and friends of Richard Nixon's through the conduit of the Greek Orthodox Church. So it'd be interesting to know more about V. John Kriebel and the Finnish Helsinki possible connections to Pasadena, and the use of Lee Harvey Oswald, who was an agent of Navy intelligence and the United States government, who was instrumental in helping. He didn't shoot a gun, but his operation was instrumental in helping get rid of John Kennedy, who lost the election to Richard Nixon in 1960. And then the rest is history. Nixon was president, and now Ronald Reagan is going to get his chance to become president. Now, what kind of a president would Ronald Reagan make? As I say, I have piles of papers here to share with you on the garden plot, the cable slicer, the California violences that went on from 1966 to 74 when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, with the use of the COINTEL program, the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Department, causing havoc and death in this state and arrests and more violence in this state than any other state in the Union. One of the proposed charters by Paul Assault, when Ronald Reagan is president, he's pushing this, is to relax the FBI, and I'll read you exactly what Paul Assault has said. Many of you have copies of this, but I think it bears repeating in case you don't. Paul Assault, who manages Ronald Reagan's campaign, he's a senator from Nevada. He has asked the FBI to investigate any person or group threatening to violate the law or whose actions have the potential for violating the law, whether the facts indicate a crime is imminent or not. If they believe that I have the potential to be violent, I can be arrested and investigated or wiretapped or mail open. I don't have to own a gun or do any violent act if they define me as potentially violent. They ask the mandate that the FBI maintain surveillance of any person who advocates violating the law, even if it is nonviolent civil disobedience. If we don't like the law, there is a new law being put into effect in Sacramento now that if you have a petition signed and one name is fraudulent or not true, the entire petition be thrown out. that is negating the right to have any petitions in California at all. That law can't exist. It's not right because any counterintelligence agent can write the wrong name and all the right people's names would be negated. We can't violate the law, but if criminals write the law and it's nonviolent civil disobedience, you can be under surveillance. Paul Lizold and Regan's group have asked the mandate that the FBI gather intelligence on any public demonstration with a potential for violence. If we go to Amnesty International, I'm sure that everyone will be photographed as we were through the Reagan administration in California, through all the anti-war meetings up and down the state and elsewhere in the country. They also asked the FBI to distribute criminal records to private employers. The criminal charges may not necessarily be cleared, but if you have a job and you were charged with any past crime, it should be able to go to your employer. They ask that they shield from prosecution for breaking the law any agent if they were following orders. Now, this is an absolute denial or negation of the Nuremberg law that we were following orders. Any agent who is following an order, even if it is to break the law, should be allowed to be freed from prosecution. If he did it, obeying an order, if he's told to blow up a bridge or to kill somebody at sight or bring them in, if he is obeying an order given to him by somebody else, he should not be prosecuted for that. And they also suggest that a new president can replace the FBI director at will the first 6 months that he's in office. He can take out anybody he wants and put in the person that he thinks should be the director of the FBI. Now, this is just a list of 5 or 6 points that Paul Lizold has recommended. He is Ronald Reagan's campaign manager. He's a member of the Senate. He gives free license to commit crimes. He gives license to bug you, to follow, to interpret, and to see whether or not you are obeying their laws, but they don't have to obey our laws. Now, we just have about 5 or 6 minutes, so I'll give you a quick rundown on the kind of people around Ronald Reagan for the time that's left, and then go back. Maybe next week we'll go into, as I say, garden plot and cable splicer and what it was like, the state of mind of Ronald Reagan as governor of California. He comes out so placid that it's hard for you people in the 49 other states to visualize what it was like here if you were politically involved in trying to express your feelings, whether it was about the war or mental hospitals or prisons or justices, the courts that were perverted. There's a man named William Casey that's managing Ronald Reagan's campaign. He's his new manager. He was described in a long article in the Washington Post. This is March the 8th, 1980. Reagan's new manager, an outsider in charge so far. And it tells how he has taken over. He was former chairman of Security and Exchange Commission, and as soon as Reagan won in New Hampshire, the primaries, the other people were fired, and he took over completely. 100 aides of Ronald Reagan were fired, and, well, it looked not intelligent. If you won in a primary in New Hampshire, then you should keep the people that helped you win. But this is the way that Wall Street, the Council of Foreign Relations, the CIA, and the Defense Department close in on Reagan and bring in Mr. Casey. He's been involved in various lawsuits. He's only 2 years younger than Reagan. He was an officer in the OSS before the CIA was formed, the Office of Strategic Service. He was chief of secret intelligence for European theater and worked with Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence in Eastern Europe. He went to school in Munich and trained in Munich, and when he came back, he had a sign on his door that he got a degree in Munich, but he didn't. This was not true. He said that he got this degree, and he's been caught at many lies, and I'll go into some of those lies with you. He worked under William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, and Donovan said, in quotes, Casey was overseeing important intelligence gathering mission during the Battle of the Bulge. That quotation is important because one of my favorite subscribers to these tapes got a book for me called Betrayal at Arnhem, and I'm going to do entire broadcast or part of a broadcast on that. It's written by A. Lorenz, published by Grosson and Dunlap in 1969. And the theme of this book is that the Battle of the Bulge was sabotage, that 10,000 men were dropped at Arnhem, 7,000 of them were killed, and the man behind the lines, the double agent who betrayed the American troops in the Netherlands, was Prince Bernhard. He worked for I.G. Farben, he worked for the Nazis. He was the man who pretended to be the resistance leader in the Bulge at the time that the Americans lost 7,000 people. The book's called Betrayal at Arnhem, and this Mr. Casey was supposed to be an important man during the Battle of the Bulge, but because his team around him works with Prince Bernhard today, and Bernhard is very much involved in counterintelligence. He formed the Bilderbergers, the organizations of heads of corporations that want to control the world and the world's resources. Bernhard did not disappear after he played this double agent game and was responsible for stalling off the victory against Adolf Hitler that they wanted to do early and end the war early until these Nazis could retrench and organize all over the world and take their money to various banks. They stalled the war, and Bernhard was instrumental in helping stall that war until the Nazis could retrench. And Mr. Casey was working in the OSS at the Battle of the Bulge, so of course history has to go a little farther into that story. He worked with the Eastern Division of the Intelligence Chief in the Battle of the Bulge and with the OSS that became the CIA. Then he became a corporate lawyer, Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, President of the Export-Import Bank, prominent in Catholic charities that later, after the war, were very heavily linked to Michael Sindona and Mr. Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, and the Gambino family I've mentioned. Another past shows the network of the Nazis with the Vatican, with Prince Bernhard, and now William Casey, the advisor in charge of Ronald Reagan's campaign, are very intelligent, thought-out links that put the pieces of history together. That's why I thought this article was so important that I read to you at length tonight, because what he's pleading about is read the past before you sweep into the future and accept atomic warfare, where more than half this country will be killed. You accept it as inevitable. Know your cast of characters from the past. Study them, confront them, write letters to the editor, call talk shows on the radio, express your feelings, and if you studied it more, you'd have more outrage instead of the complacency of, well, if we're going to die, we'll die fast. There's a lot to live for, and there's a lot for them to explain. So read some of these old books and study these pieces. Time is out now, so I'll have to continue. Next week, I'll go into some more of the people behind Ronald Reagan and then get on with Jimmy Carter also and possibly John Anderson. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You keep well and study your books, and I'll be back with you next week.